Good evening, Ross. Andrew here from the Lamborghini Club America, calling you from Michigan. How are things down in Texas?
Well, hello from Austin. We're getting by. We're still in lockdown around here, but nature doesn't know it. And so the flowers are out, the birds are singing, and the trees are all green. So it's lovely.
So you're down in Texas where you have great weather, as opposed to Michigan. I can only drive in the spring, summer, and a little bit of the fall. Do you drive year round in Texas?
I have the opposite problem with weather in Austin that you do in Michigan. I can drive from October to about mid-May, and then it gets so warm out that in these vintage cars, unless you really enjoy sitting in a steam room, it's very, very limited. It's really a hot winter down here.
That makes sense. I know these vintage Lamborghinis can run pretty hot, and a Texas summer wouldn't be a perfect match. So what's the reaction like when you show up to a gas station in your Miura, your 350, or your Huracan or Aventador when you had them? How does the public react to the modern Lamborghini and the vintage Lamborghini?
So my number one most favorite part of owning these vintage cars is the sharing part. I know that as soon as I pull out of my driveway, whether I'm going for a big cruise or just going to get fuel, that chances are someone's going to want to talk to me, or they're going to honk at me, they're going to give me a big thumbs up, and it might be a 7-year-old boy or it might be a 75-year-old man, particularly when I stop at the gas station. I know I've got to add 5 or 10 minutes to whatever my schedule is. Somebody's going to want to come over and ask, what is that? Or, oh, I remember when I was a teenager. Or, can I take a picture of it? Or, could my boy stand next to it? Or, could my daughter sit in the seat? Um, People don't come over with trepidation. They also don't come over feeling like, ooh, I don't know if I should go talk to the wealthy guy. The vintage Lamborghinis somehow send off this sixth sense of welcome, come talk to me, come take a look at this thing, and let's talk about history. And having those little vignettes, those little conversations are such a pleasure because I know that that person is going home at the end of their day with a little bit more joy and one more smile than they otherwise would have.
Those are all very good points. I think that I share the same experience when stopping somewhere with my car. The most attention I've gotten in the past is with my Diablo. Of all the cars I've owned, the Diablo has grabbed more attention than any of them. It was red on tan, Diablo VT 1994. And I remember some of the interactions were very interesting. One gentleman approached me as I was putting premium in the car and yelled at me to stop, and then I needed to put race gas in the thing. As if he was an expert, he said that he had heard that from somebody somewhere before, and he was worried about me damaging the car somehow by putting 93 octane as opposed to 110 in it. So it's funny how, rumors get around about these cars and experts come out of the woodwork, and all these little pieces of information that to not be true, but it's a fun part of the story. Another reaction is people asking if you need a racing license to be able to drive a Lamborghini on the road. That's one that I've gotten more than a few times. Thank you, Ross. So I'd like to ask you some questions about your Lamborghini hobby. First of all, what got you into the brand?
Well, I think first I should take exception with it being a hobby. I think it's really an
Okay.
addiction. As far as what got me into the Lamborghini brand, it's actually what's right behind me, behind the blue car here, and that was actually racing in the Ferrari Challenge Series. I spent 2014 and 15 being this deep in Pro-Am racing all over the country. And after 2 years of hanging out with the biggest Ferrari collectors in the world and some really fast amateur racers, I decided that I wanted to jump into having some vintage cars as well. And after having looked all around the landscape, I decided that the car I wanted to start with was a Lamborghini Miura.
So did you come into the Lamborghini hobby as a racer from the Ferrari world, or did you just come in with a car to drive on the road?
I came very, very close to jumping into the Lamborghini series. In fact, went out to Lamborghini headquarters to meet with the folks out there in Italy. And just as I was getting ready to consider that change and do a test day in one of the Lamborghini cars. I came in very, very strong in the World Finals and Ferrari Challenge in Mugello that year and realized that my body had had enough. I had blown out my back and I needed to hang up my helmet, as they say, and start going from loving cars at 190 miles an hour to doing what we're doing right here and loving cars when they're standing still.
You say that, but I know that you drive your Lamborghinis quite a bit. On average, how often do you drive one of your Lamborghinis?
I try and take my Lamborghinis out as often as the weather will permit here in Austin. During sort of October to May, when the weather is great around here, I try and make sure that I'm in one of my two cars, either the 350 that you see behind me or the Miura just on the other side of the garage here, at least once a week, and if I can, more often than that.
That's great. So are those the only two Lamborghinis you have owned, or have you had others as well?
My Lamborghini addiction has pretty much touched all of the modern Lamborghinis and then two of these vintage Lamborghinis. I started out with a 2015 Huracan. When that car first came out, it was awesome. In fact, I had just finished driving the Ferrari 458 Challenge car, which was a track-only car. And in my stock street Huracan, I blew the wheels off of one of my friends out on Circuit of the Americas here, just toe-to-toe, and within 100 meters, I was 10 car lengths ahead of him. I've had a 2018, I believe, Aventador S, the first year that they revised the Aventador to its current generation, and that was an awesome beast. I owned a Urus, one of the first 5 Uruses that came into Texas when they first came out, and really was the second passenger or second driver on that car behind my wife. And then these two awesome, fantastic, just make you feel so good vintage Lamborghinis in the Miura and the 350.
So your passion for Lamborghini has really started with the beginning of the brand with the 350 GT. It's moved to the Miura, which everyone considers the first supercar. And you've come all the way to the modern end of the brand with the Urus, Huracan, and Aventador. What do you like about each side of the brand? The vintage side and the modern side of the brand?
I enjoy both of them, and they're complementary, and they really touch two very deeply different emotions in me and what I'm after. The modern cars are just these surreal, fast, perfect, incredible machines that will do just about anything you want them to do, even if the car has a lot more skill than the driver does, which has happened in this particular driver's case. And then the vintage cars do something completely different for me. They are just stunning to look at. They're passionate. They really do have that 60s Sophia Loren kind of feeling to them. They look like they're moving fast even when they're standing still. And the sound and smell of carburetors. Oh, there's nothing like carburetors. I love the perfume I have on this shirt when I get out of my Miura. My wife doesn't like it, but I just think it's the sexiest smell going.
So you mentioned the 350 GT and your Miura. What's the driving experience like between the two cars? Do you have a favorite, or would you just consider them different and it's impossible to pick one over the other?
I really enjoy owning both the 350 GT and the Miura. They're so complementary, even though one came right after the other, and they share more or less the same engine, one more slightly evolved than the other. They're two completely different cars. The 350 is really a gentleman's touring car. It's the car that I'll take out into the Texas Hill Country to go see the Bluebonnets, take my wife to dinner. She's happy to be in it for 100 miles, finds it very comfortable, and it's fantastic for just cruising around. The Miura, on the other hand, is when I really want to be by myself. I really don't even need to go more than 35 miles an hour because I've got some back hill country roads around here where it's marked 15, and if I can do it at 19 or 20, my heart is beating pretty fast. You know, I've thought a little bit how to describe this to folks, and I really enjoy Italian white wine, Pinot Grigio. I also really enjoy great Kentucky bourbon. This blue car is Pinot Grigio. My orange Miura is Kentucky bourbon.
So I like what you said about the 350 and the Miura having very similar engines, and that's true. The 350 GT has a 3.5 liter Lamborghini V12 with a ZF gearbox bolted to it, With the Miura, they more or less have the same block, but the bore was enlarged so they get 4 liters, and it has the gearbox molded or casted into the same piece as the engine, and it's turned sideways. But other than that, they are very similar. The crank, the heads, everything is more or less the same.
They're really similar. I've had the opportunity to pretty much stick my head literally into both of them, having done work on 3 engines that are actually in my garage here, one in each car, and then one that you can see over here on the stand, where I've built this awesome 350 GT display engine that has a really interesting story and history to it. But having looked in both engines, it's fascinating and amazing to me what these folks, these gentlemen did back in the early 60s to envision what we see here and what we're still driving. These are awesome engines, and the sounds and the power and I keep coming back to it, but that passionate feeling that these engines put out is just awesome.
Yeah, so the Lamborghini display engine you have there, tell us a little more about it. I received an email today from Jim Kaminsky in Florida. He was pretty inquisitive about where that engine came from and how it came to you. Apparently you sent him some photos a few days ago?
I've been, over the last 6 months or a year, building this 350 GT display engine. And thanks so much to the help and support and advice that you've given me, and Jim Kaminsky and several others of the old timers, the sages in the Lamborghini vintage community, I've been able to take this thing to a pretty impressive, almost done state. I didn't know that I was going to be building a 350 display engine. It sort of pretty much landed in my driveway. Again, thanks to you, when you discovered while looking at some old 350 GT, or actually old Lamborghini parts that you had opportunity to pick up, that there was this strange block in the back of someone's garage. And when you looked at it, you realized it had the same block number as the engine in my car. And it ends up that the blocks were swapped at one point. A 4-liter block was put in my car and stamped with the new number. In order to maintain the integrity of this vehicle, we picked up that block, we've built a stunning display engine out of it, and now we've got even more complete history on this beautiful blue car behind me.
Yeah, when these cars were not as old and not as valuable, like the 70s, 80s, early 90s even, it was considered an upgrade to put a 4-liter engine in that car, and that's why a lot of people did it. For more power and more performance, they weren't thinking of the originality or the authenticity through value of the future.
So I've been fortunate enough, lucky enough, to get the best of everything. I've got a little bit more power in the car itself, thanks to the 4-liter block that we believe is in it, although we've never had the block separate from the top of the engine, so we've never been able to measure whether it's those 4 or 5 millimeter difference. I've got this awesome display engine and the chance to preserve the history so that I don't think there'll ever be a future owner of this car, but if it is, they all go together. And the chance to tell this great story and wonder what's really in here.
Yeah, I love that display stand that you guys made. It looks just like the 1963 Motor Show display stand that Ferruccio stood next to with his 350 GTV engine.
The display engine that we designed for the display engine behind me was really inspired by what Ferruccio Lamborghini did with his original display engine stand. We at first looked at doing an exact replica of it and decided that we wanted to take the inspiration of it but not go too retro, because it would look a little bit out of place if we did it exactly, just a little bit too much of a throwback. But it's pretty good looking, and I'm so excited to have a team here in Austin that I work with that not only could get near perfection out of my vehicles, but I could work with on an artistic venture like this.
You're fortunate to have a local shop to you. Most of us have to ship our cars to another state to get service done if it's a vintage Lamborghini. You know, the dealer network has grown enough for the modern cars. Most people have a dealer in their state, but with the vintage cars, not every dealer will work on them. So there's only a few specialty shops that work on the vintage Lamborghinis. So you're in good shape down there in Texas.
Well, having the Miura as my first vintage Lamborghini was a real learning lesson for me about what you need to really be successful as a vintage owner in the way that I wanted to do it. I wanted a car that 95% of the time, minimum, I could put the key in, turn it, and go do what I wanted to go do. Not the 50% of the time, and in fact, the car doesn't let you know which 50 it's going to be. I'm very, very fortunate to have learned that right here in Austin, Texas, there's an awesome restoration shop that's 25 years in the business called Team CJ. And there's at least two wonderful things that have come out of that 3 or 4 year relationship with them. One is that I'm able to get local restoration, local service and maintenance when the smallest thing goes bad or wrong, or if I have a super big full restoration project. The other thing that I get out of this group, which I have come to learn is quite rare, is that when I get my car back, it's actually better, not just different, than when I sent it off to the shop. It's sort of like what Steve Jobs used to talk about, that his dad said when he had to paint the fence in his backyard. And his dad said, "You got to paint the back of the fence that faces the neighbor, son." And he said, "Why?" "We won't see it." And his dad said, "But we'll know." And Team CJ gives me back a car where the back side of the fence is painted as well.
It's great to have a shop that takes care of your car like you would take care of it.
Yeah, it really makes the vintage experience great. If I was isolated in an area where every time I had some need in the vehicle, I had to put it on a truck and think about it for months, the joy factor in the process would go down quite a bit because these cars are 50 years old plus, and they do need a lot of caring and a lot of love. Usually it's not terrible, and sometimes it's just measured in minutes or hours of getting something just right, but it is part of the ownership experience, and it makes it very different than owning a modern car that you take in at 7,000 miles, you change the oil, and you don't have to see the dealer for a year or two. But I'll point out that I think for me at least, that's a feature, not a bug, of the vintage experience. Because as part of loving these cars, you get to know them in such detail. And in having to know them in such detail, you end up meeting other folks like you or Jim or any of the folks that I met at Concorso last year. And so the social experience feeds itself as well. And it's a great circle.
I agree with you completely on the perks of being a vintage Lamborghini owner. I also own vintage Lamborghinis. But an interesting question, I started kind of in the middle. My first Lamborghini was a Diablo in 2005, so it wasn't the newest the brand had, but it wasn't the oldest. You started at the modern day with a Huracan, then a Aventador, and then you started all the way back with the 350 GT and the Miura. What advice would you have for another owner making that transition in either adding a vintage Lamborghini to his garage or replacing a current Lamborghini?
Well, my advice to any Lamborghini owner who's trying to decide between do I get the modern car or the vintage car is unfortunately, you need both. Really, seriously, I can't recommend it enough. It's do you want to only drink red wine or only drink white wine? They really, you want to have both to open up. The modern car is something that you can just get in and feel this sense of perfection and go super fast if you want. But the vintage car is an experience to drive cars in the way that they were intended. We have such evolved cars today, and I'm not talking about Teslas that are super fast but sort of neutered in an old-fashioned way, but such evolved cars that let you to get pretty close to sort of 9 or 10 tenths of the driving law that you lose that feeling of having to push a car into the corner or having to wonder, could I get a little bit more out of this thing? Or here's the thing that I enjoy the most in the vintage cars. It's the sharing. When I pull up to a gas station, and of course these days I've got my mask on, so it might not happen as often, but I always have to leave an extra 5 or 10 minutes because I know that someone at that gas station is going to want to come over and ask me about the car and ask if they could take a picture and tell me maybe some story about where it fit in their teenage years or their childhood. And to me, that is very, very humbling and so enjoyable. The sharing is the best part. It's the joy of watching someone remember something from when they were a teenager, or watching a 6-year-old boy get in this car and just like back in the day when I, would have the Countach poster up on the wall next to Farrah Fawcett, of course, paying attention to the Countach. It's the vintage experience is irreplaceable. And I'd add one other thing about the way that the modern and the vintage Lamborghini experience are complementary. You can spend a lot of money on both. The good news is that on the vintage side, the longer you own the car, the more it's worth.
That's a very good point, and something that a lot of us enjoy about the cars, because every dollar that we put into it or every hour in care, we know that it's going to come back to us eventually financially. Although that isn't a driver for most people, it's a nice part of it. So you mentioned wearing a mask to the gas station, and that brings up the obvious topic that's on everyone's mind, the pandemic that's going on, which is what drew the necessity to do this video call with you instead of coming down to Texas to visit. And with that, the Lamborghini Club has formed a team page with the CDC Foundation to help collect funds to support the cause of helping lower the impact of this pandemic. I know that you've done a lot of charitable things in the past, including bidding on things in Monterey and purchasing paintings for direct donations to charity. So what would you say to others to encourage them or explain the benefit of being charitable through this car passion that we share?
Well, Andrew, I'm really glad that you're asking about how we might think about participating for good in the middle of what's going on and not feeling conflicted, as I did when you invited me to do this right here, about is it really inappropriate to be talking about my Lamborghinis, or even more inappropriate to be driving my Lamborghinis now with the incredibly terrible situation that's going on. Here's how I think about it. First of all, when I go out in the 350 or the Miura, and I go to the gas station or I drive down the road, I put the smile on someone's face that day, and they don't have as many smiles as they usually do. So if I'm adding a little bit to joy, I feel like that's a small contribution I can make. I have studied Lamborghini history pretty closely and always remind myself that Lamborghini came from Mr. Lamborghini, Ferruccio Lamborghini, and his history just prior to starting the company, which was in tractors and other things, was he fought in World War II, now not on our side, but he was a prisoner of war. And he must have had a bunch of sorrow and sadness and confinement in his life. And here we are 60 and 70 years later, and look at the joy that we're getting from the inspiration he took out of the saddest, darkest days to do something. The last thing that I would mention is that if I'm going to continue to feel as blessed, as lucky as I do to have access to these vehicles and friends like you, I feel like there should be a little bit of ante. And the ante should be that there's a contribution made to folks who are truly in need. And I'm not talking about a little bit of money. So if I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in the last few years just on the care and feeding and restoration and maintenance of my two vintage cars, I think that, what should the number be? 1%, 5%, 10% of that should go to charity? Do I feel like that's a fair contribution to say thank you and feel gratitude and humility for having this kind of life? Personally, I do. And so I'm happy to jump into what you always do and adding a charitable component to your events.
Thank you, Ross. That's well put. And I don't know if I've ever heard someone explain a justification for making charity a priority like you just explained. Thank you very much. The 350 GT in back of you, last year you took it to Monterey and you did pretty well at Concorso Italiano. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
It started with a phone call conversation that you and I had maybe 2 years ago, and I said, hey man, I'm in absolutely no rush, but somewhere in the next 2 years, I'd love to get my hands on a 350 or a 400. Well, 2 weeks later, you had a car that I had to buy, which came in, and then I thought I was going to do this much restoration to it. Instead, I did this much restoration, all with your help. And I was pretty anxious and scared to take it to Concorso. You told me you got to come. It's not what you think. It's going to be a great event, and it's really low key. And it was. And I went as a nervous rookie. I had so much fun that day, got to meet so many awesome people, and ended up at the end of the day with a lovely plexiglass trophy where I won best in class for my vintage, and then was stunned later that night at the Serrata event that you put on, which was awesome, to take away that large Stanley Cup looking trophy in the background here called the Bull Trophy, and winning best in show for the best Lamborghini Concorso for all of 2019. And it was just very humbling.
You mentioned how you got the 350 GT, Ross. That's one of the beauties of club membership, is the networking that occurs between owners. When you mentioned that you were looking for a 350 GT, I kept my ears open and I heard of a club member that was thinking about selling one. I connected you two, and there we are.
That's pretty much the way it went down.
You know, there's always some small details in negotiating and things like that, but I'm happy that you got the car and you've been able to enjoy it so much. So what was the judging experience like at Concorso Italiano?
At Concorso, the judging was really fun and enjoyable looking back at it. In the moment, I was one nervous guy just chewing my fingers down to the nubs. I forget what time in the morning they came around, but if we got there at 8, the judges came around at 9:30, and I thought I was going to have a very tight Ferrari kind of experience with a lot of, chest beating and ego and elbows and all that kind of stuff. And it was instead delightful. I had a little story I had rehearsed. The guys were kind enough to allow me to babble in front of them. They looked all around the car. They weren't stone-faced. They gave me very positive feedback. They told me they were happy to have me there. And the only tricky moment was right at the end of the judging, where they asked me to start the car. And I got in and knew that I needed to have my buddy in the trunk waving a magnetic wand to disconnect the relay for theft prevention. And it was really tricky. Well, 45 seconds and about 6 swipes went by and we couldn't get the car started. The judges are looking at me like, Garber, you're going to get about one more try here. And fortunately, on the next one, it turned over. And wouldn't you know it, a few hours later, I had a little blue slip under my windshield telling me that I had won something.
That's a cool story. I remember walking by, I was judging the modern Lamborghinis. You had separate judges for the vintage Lamborghinis. But I remember Valentino Balboni over at your car with a hood up, and a whole crowd had gathered around to listen to what Valentino was saying about your engine and the 350 in general, and about where the brand came from. So with your Lamborghini passion, Ross, what's the next thing you're going to do? Do you have any other cars in mind, or any events that are coming up after the pandemic's over, of course?
Well, Andrew, I think that the next thing in my Lamborghini passion is going to be the next and final phase of restoration on my Miura. We're going to take the engine out and do a complete engine rebuild. We've done the transmission and exhaust and suspension and ignition and all kinds of things. But now we're going to get to the sort of meat of the meal. And may also do paint as well and put it on a rotisserie and take the paint that's been on there since the middle 90s and do a concourse paint restoration. That's still to be determined. And of course, then I've just got a few leftovers left on the display engine here, and that should take me through the next year or two.
So the Miura project you mentioned about doing the mechanical and restoration work, I know projects like that can cost in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but what is the time commitment for having your car in a shop for that type of work?
One of the things that I learned about restoration work on vintage cars is that it is not like working on new cars, and things take quite some time to get right. And as a new guy in, you look at it and the guy tells you it's going to take 2 or 3 years to do a 5,000-hour restoration. And you always ask, how's that possible? How could you not do that in 6 months if we just throw more guys at it? I can now tell you that if you were going to do a full rotisserie restoration on a Miura, it's going to take 3 or 4 years. Just like having a baby takes 9 months. You might want it faster, but it's not going to happen. On my project, the engine will probably take 6 to 9 months if we just do that. If we do paint, it's going to be 1 to 2 years.
From hearing your stories and seeing your garage and the way you describe the Lamborghini brand, I can see that it's a big part of your life. How does that integrate into your family? Is this something that you do separate, or do any of your kids or your wife participate in the Lamborghini hobby with you?
When I was talking to you just a little bit earlier in this interview about my Lamborghini experience, a big part of it is the social aspect. And the reason that that is a big part is because my Lamborghini experience is really a family experience. My wife and I do a lot of Lamborghini stuff together. It's not just guys with red cars. Um, Even the Giro that we did through Colorado, New Mexico 2 years ago, and having the CEO of Lamborghini North America take 4 days of his life just to come and drive with us, and all the wives that came with their husbands on that event, or taking my son to the Lamborghini Festival in Houston and sharing that as a father-son event. There's several things that we've done together as a family, and it doesn't force me to have to make a decision between, am I going to go enjoy my hobby or am I going to go spend time with my family?
That's great that you're able to integrate both of them together. So you told us all about how you got the 350 GT into your garage. How about the Miura? How did that come about?
My Miura came to my garage and I had no idea I was getting a Miura.
How is that possible?
So a Miura shows up in my garage and I didn't know I was buying one. My wife surprised me with it. We had a big year back in 2016. It was my 50th birthday. It was our 25th anniversary, and she wanted to do something incredibly special for me. And she went out on her own, never done anything like this before, either with cars or order of magnitude spending, and figured out how to find a great Miura, put it in the garage with a big old bow on it, and get me to come down the driveway with her one day in the car. And as we approached the garage, I sort of wondered why the garage door was up and looked in. And there was my daughter and my son-in-law sitting in the car with big smiles and greeted me with this Miura in my garage, and was in a state that I don't normally get to very often, which was speechless.
You know, the only other person that I know that's been given a Miura is Jay Leno. The yellow Miura that Jay has was given to him by somebody that wasn't happy with it. But you, on the other hand, it was given as a gift of joy, which is a really neat story.
So grateful to my wife. Was just incredible to see the expression of love that she put into making that happen. And it is something that has become, as they say, the gift that keeps on giving, because the Miura led to the Lamborghini lifestyle and a few friendships like you and I have developed that are not just acquaintances, and the 350, and so many things over the last 3 or 4 years that have really defined my life that I didn't know was going to happen. And it's been awesome.
Okay, Ross, so we've gone through a lot of different parts of the hobby. Now we have some rapid fire questions that we'd
Okay,
like to
put my
try
hand on the
and-
buzzer.
Perfect. We'll see if you can answer within 2 minutes. So, what's your dream Lamborghini?
A Miura SV.
And if you were driving that Miura SV, would you be driving it in the USA or in Italy?
100% in Italy.
Who would be in the passenger seat with you?
I think I'd love to have the Formula One driver, Daniel Ricciardo.
Okay. Not your wife or Valentino Balboni, maybe?
Well, I've been very fortunate to have both of them in the car with me already. And if I'm driving an SV through the roads of Italy, I'm going fast. And that means I want another fast guy right next to me who's going to make me laugh.
That's a good answer. I don't think I'd argue with that logic at all. What snacks would you have in the car?
What snacks would I have in the car? Oh, I think I'd have a bottle of water up over here. And then
Okay.
I'd probably have a beer down below my seat that nobody can see.
No, those are drinks, not snacks.
Oh, if I was in Italy, I'd probably have a salami or something like that.
Okay.
But Danny Ricciardo would have to have the knife to slice it because I'd be two hands on the wheel.
That sounds like Jack Riddell at Concorso Italiano. He always has a wine and cheese display set up while he's socializing with friends.
Yeah, I was parked next to Jack last year with the 350 here, and I got to see the spread that guy puts on. He is so fun.
Okay, we're eating up your shot clock here, so we better move on. Automatic gearbox or manual gearbox in general?
I don't own any cars with automatic gearboxes.
You've owned them in the past.
Yeah, I've done the paddle shift thing, and it's fast, but I love going clutch in and downshifting and upshifting.
Okay, so what's the best sounding Lamborghini?
The best sounding Lamborghini, I would give it a tie. I'd say the Huracan just has a fantastic throttle sound. But I'm a carburetor guy, and man, when you rev up the Miura, there are very few sounds in the world that are as beautiful as that.
Okay, so if you had $10,000 to spend on your Lamborghini hobby in any way, for the cars, for a trip, for some clothing, how would you spend $10,000 toward your Lamborghini passion?
I would take 10 grand and I would rent some awesome hotel rooms and find some great restaurants all about 400 miles, one in front of the other, and just keep going and have a great day in my Miura or any of the other cars, and then stop and eat a great meal until I was out of $10,000.
That sounds like a fantastic time. With you living in Texas, maybe one winter we could do something like that. We could get fellow Miura owners to ship their cars down to Texas and drive in the mild weather.
That'd be a heck of a lot of fun.
So Ross, you've spent a lot of time on the road and the track during your racing days. What would be some driving advice for fellow Lamborghini owners that you might have? Whether it be driving your vintage Lamborghini or your modern Lamborghini, what advice would you have in handling that beast?
First thing is, don't be an idiot. If you've got a car that can go 4 times the speed limit, don't do it unless you're on a track. It's actually much safer on a track with other people going fast at about the same speed in the same direction than it is out on some highway or country road. So take it to the track would be my first piece of advice. My other piece of advice, regardless of whether it's a modern Lamborghini or a vintage Lamborghini, is always prep and check your car before you go hard in it. Check your tire pressures, check your brake fluid, and make sure you've put in high temp brake fluid, because brake failure sucks. And I can tell you I've had it at 170 miles an hour. Check your alignment. Do all the kinds of things to make sure that your car is not going to blow up while you're going super fast, because it's not fun.
You make a very good point about being a responsible driver. I am personally embarrassed when I see a YouTube video of a Lamborghini on the road, somebody doing something very stupid, and the results of what happens. So you make a very good point. Driving responsibly is a key part of the hobby, and driving at fast speed is something that's really intended for the track in a controlled environment, of course.
I would add that if you're someone who's fortunate enough and has the financial resources to be able to own a Lamborghini, you're also someone who can spend $500 or a couple $1,000 and find yourself a track day and get out and go blow it out on the track, and then be normal and respectful on the regular roads. But for $500 or even $5,000, you can do it if you own a Lamborghini, and that's the place to go find out what your car and what your ego can really handle.
That's very true. It's a small investment to do something the right way. So Ross, you have more miles on Lamborghinis than most owners I know. On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate yourself as a driver of either your vintage cars or your modern cars?
How do I rate myself? Well, I'm glad you're not asking my wife, because she'd probably say a 3. I would rate myself as quite competent, but not expert. So I might put myself in the 6 or 7 category. And I've had the opportunity to hang out with pro racers and see what 9s look like. And unless you're Lewis Hamilton or someone playing up at that level, you're not an 8 and you're not a 9. You're a 5 or a 6 on your best day.
I think that's a very accurate perspective of driving skill. You know, guys with their egos, every one of us think, we think of ourselves as tens, driving our cars. But the truth is, every time you drive it, you learn a little bit more about the car and better driving.
Yes, and that's one of the great things that you learn if you go out and take enough laps on a track is you will lose control. You will spin out. And it is a good way to put your ego in check. Like I did one time when I was racing at Daytona International Speedway and lost it breaking into the bus stop on the backside of the track. Lost control at 161 miles an hour and went into a 4-cycle spin. That was not fun. It's quite humbling. The challenge that you have to keep in mind if you're driving a modern Lamborghini very fast is that these cars, without all of the computer controls in them, would be undrivable beasts. There is no way you'd be able to handle them. And part of the magic that Lamborghini is engineered into them is to make them so much more approachable that you can get 7 or 8 or 9/10 out of the car being an average driver. But the moment that you cross over that line, you cross over that threshold, you're now going so much faster with so much load in that car in a much more dangerous situation that car, if you're going for a ride, man, you are really going for a ride. And you just got to make sure you're really signed up for that.
With regard to the newer cars you own, are you all about originality and authenticity like you are with your vintage cars? Or are you into a lot of aftermarket mods with your cars?
I'm a completely authentic, original guy. I like driving it for what it has because I can't get at it all anyway.
What do you like about the Lamborghini brand as it was in the 60s and 70s? And what do you like about the Lamborghini now in the present time?
I think the things that I really like about the Lamborghini brand, whether it's vintage from the 60s or modern in 2020, are pretty similar. They have their own personality differences, but the first thing is the passion. There's something about Italian, and then there's something about Lamborghini Italian that is beyond a particular word that could describe it really well. The second thing that I love about the Lamborghini brand is that it is so small, so exclusive, so rare, but also very approachable at the same time. It's not a mass market brand where there's 10,000 of them, right? There's only 120 350s that were made back in the 60s, so maybe there's a few dozen left. But it's really accessible in terms of the information and the folks that you're with. I think that the third thing is just the incredible sense of thoughtful engineering that you get out of driving a vintage Lamborghini or a modern Lamborghini, whether it was Bob Wallace and those guys back in the 60s or the team right now. The sense of being on the edge of what's possible was very different across 50 years, but you really do get that feeling of this was what was at the limit of what was possible, and it's so fun to participate in that.
That's true. Lamborghini's been at the limit of what's possible throughout the entire brand's history. And that is also something that made me fall in love with the brand was, it's extreme, uncompromising, and Italian.
Well said.
When you're driving your Lamborghinis, do you drive with the radio on or with the radio off?
Radio off, 100% of the time.
Ross, thank you very much for the time today in chatting over this video call. I look forward to seeing you soon, and take it easy down in Texas.
Thank you, Andrew. And I wish everyone in the community health and better times ahead, and appreciate you having me on.